Chapter 3. It ended up being the Russians who reached Berlin first. After pushing in from Poland, they besieged the city and began shelling it on April 20th, 1945. Ironically, it was Hitler's 56th birthday, but the presents the Soviets rained down were of the 100mm high explosive variety launched from field artillery pieces a few miles away. 10 days later, after realizing there was no hope left, the Fuhrer gave the world an even better gift by reportedly committing suicide in an underground bunker. With their leader out of the picture, their country overrun, and their army in shambles, Germany had no choice but to submit. Their delegates signed the Instrument of Surrender on May 8th, thus bringing to a close the war in Europe. Japan took a little longer to persuade. As they gradually lost island after island in the Pacific, and as Allied forces crept closer and closer to their shores, they hunkered down for what was sure to be an even bigger fight on their mainland. The United States abruptly changed their minds, however, after utterly decimating two of their cities with a new toy called an atom bomb. Japan quickly realized that any further fighting would only be futile, and on September 2nd, the Japanese Foreign Affairs Minister met with officials aboard the battleship USS Missouri for a formal surrender. With the stroke of a fountain pen, World War II was over. After 7 bloody years, the shooting, shelling, and bombing finally stopped, and the nations of the world could stand up, dust themselves off, and assess the damage. The toll was great. Of the 1.9 billion people who had participated, approximately 72 million had been sacrificed upon the altar of war. If the dead were all buried in a single cemetery, it would be 124 square miles and take over 2 hours to drive across, with nothing but tombstones for scenery. Walter Thomas had been one of the fortunate ones. Aside from receiving some minor wounds along the way, he managed to make it through to the war's end in one piece. He received an honorable discharge from the Army in 1946 with the rank of captain and returned to the family farm on the outskirts of St. Louis to seek a quieter life. There he boxed up his war memorabilia, shoved it to the rear of the closet, and tried to forget the horrors he had seen. He married a local girl named Edna, who in 1950 bore him a son. They named the baby Edward after her grandfather. In 1968, as the Vietnam conflict raged in the faraway jungles of Indochina, both Walter and Edna lay awake at night, worried that Edward's 18th birthday was rapidly approaching, and with it, his eligibility for the draft. In an effort to avoid the war, Edward enrolled in college, where he attended classes for 2 years until he met and married a lovely girl named Vivian. The young couple lived with Walter and Edna until one day both of them came home with life-changing news. Hers was joyous. She was expecting. His was not. He had just received a letter from the Selective Service Board. He had been drafted. Edward was shipped off to basic training in the summer of 1970, with his father, mother, and very pregnant wife bidding him farewell at the bus stop. 4 months later, 2 things arrived at the Thomases' doorstep. The first had been delivered by Vivian's doctor, a baby girl named Diane that weighed 6 pounds 8 ounces. The second had been delivered by a casualty notifications officer sent by the Department of Defense. Edward had been killed in the Binh Dinh province of south-central Vietnam. Though all 3 were devastated by the loss, Vivian was the most affected. In a fit of postpartum depression, she borrowed the car, left the baby behind, and never returned. For the second time that week, a uniformed man darkened Walter and Edna's door to deliver terrible news. The Missouri State Trooper informed Walter that they had found his car wrecked in a grove of trees just off Highway 21. The young female driver had not been wearing seat belts and had not survived. Nobody was willing to speculate if it had been an accident or not, though most suspected it hadn't. There was no question that Walter and Edna would raise Diane. They legally adopted her and cared for her as though she were their own. Walter and Edna never tried to hide the fact they were her grandparents, but to them, Diane was simply their daughter. Diane felt the same, calling them Mom and Dad her whole life. She graduated high school and moved out of state to attend college, where she studied political science at the University of Chicago. Upon receiving her degree, she moved to D.C. to intern with a large lobbying firm. Diane eventually married a naval officer named Paul Breckinridge, a rugged and handsome SEAL stationed at the nearby Naval Amphibious Base in Virginia. Paul and Walter, given their mutual military background, got along famously when Paul and Diane came to visit. During one trip, the couple had the added pleasure of announcing that Walter and Edna would once again be grandparents, technically great-grandparents. The following year, Diane gave birth to a chubby blonde-haired boy they named Scott. For the next few years, Diane, Paul, and Scott made the drive to St. Louis every 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. There had been a few times when only Diane and Scott could make the journey because Paul had been deployed, but all three were able to make the trip the holidays before Paul shipped out for Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was the last time they would gather as a family. Paul's Chinook helicopter was hit by a surface-to-air missile near Fallujah and twirled its way drunkenly to the ground like a giant burning maple seed. Walter and Edna tried to persuade Diane to come live with them in Missouri, but she had no desire. Her home, job, and life were in D.C., and Scott had already started kindergarten there. She assured them they would be okay and that she would somehow manage. For the next few years, her and Scott's visits dwindled until they only came at Christmas. Most visits, Walter and Edna barely even recognized Scott, not only because he was growing so fast, but because most of the time he had some type of electronic gaming device held up in front of his face. The final trip Diane and Scott made to Missouri was in 2010. A few years earlier, Edna had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors had given her 2 years, and she defied them by living 3. She died at age 77. Later, as Walter was looking over the family photos spread throughout the house and saw the smiling faces of Edward, Vivian, Paul, and Edna, he lamented that it seemed as though their family's timeline was marked not with milestones, but with tombstones. Like the war, he wondered how it was that he should go on while the others didn't. Sometimes he felt it was harder to be the survivor. For the first time in his life, Walter found himself living alone. Now in his 80s, it was an utterly foreign concept to him. The silence around the home was deafening, and he often turned on the radio or television just to have some noise to ease the loneliness. The ladies at his church gave never-ending recommendations as to how he should best fill the void, everything from puppies to kittens, and even occasionally tossing in the names of some recently widowed women. Walter politely declined each suggestion. Dogs required too much maintenance, he was allergic to cats, and as far as dating went, he had no interest in meeting anyone new, or old, as it were. He subsequently had plenty of time on his hands. He had long retired, and most of his friends had already passed away. He didn't golf, and had no desire to join any senior citizen communities. Instead, he filled the time by volunteering at the local VA hospital and helping returning vets face whatever demons were haunting them. That was when the memory loss began. It came on slowly, when a few times he couldn't remember where he had left his car keys, but steadily progressed into a few times when he couldn't even remember where he had left his car, or that he even owned one. Most days were good, with no trace of anything being wrong with his brain, but the day he wound up driving the wrong way down a one-way street was the day he finally admitted it was probably time to get checked out. A visit to his doctor revealed that while he was in surprisingly good physical shape for someone his age, he had the earliest onset of dementia. Walter took the news in stride, finding it most ironic that he had outlived the majority of his generation, only to end up having absolutely no recollection of it. Still, the prospect of knowing that in time his cheese would inevitably slide off his cracker for good was quite sobering. It was for this reason Walter found himself standing beside an orange moving van backed into the drive of a house buried deep in the D.C. suburbs. It was Diane's home, but as inviting as it was, it caused him mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was glad he would be seeing more of his granddaughter and great-grandson. On the other hand, he also found it severely depressing. It was, after all, the place he was going to be writing the final chapter of his life. Scott Breckinridge was not a happy camper. Not only had his mother recently delivered the devastating news that he would soon be sharing his home with a virtual stranger, but she had added insult to injury by unceremoniously evicting the 18-year-old from his room and transplanting him to the smaller one down the hall. Everything he owned had to be hauled out. Bed, dresser, lamps, nightstands, bookshelves, mini-fridge, 21 Pilots and Doctor Who posters, clothes, and his desk, cluttered with disemboweled computer towers and their accompanying stacks of components. Every possession had to go. He felt like a refugee being relocated. He still couldn't understand why his great-grandfather had to move in with them, or why he couldn't take the smaller room. Diane had said it was because the larger one was closer to the bathroom, though Scott really didn't see what that had to do with anything. If she was so concerned about the old man's bowels, why didn't she give up the upstairs master bed and bath? Instead, it was Scott who was made to suffer. He couldn't help but feel bitter. Aside from his father when he was a kid, he had never lived with anyone but his mother. Yet now he was expected to share space with another man? Sure, Walter was a relative, but a distant one he saw only once a year. Now this invader was going to have free roam of their home. He would be wandering their halls, probably in his boxers, watching their TV, probably old reruns, and eating from their fridge, probably prunes and bottles of Ensure. Worse, since there was only one downstairs bathroom, it meant this guy would be using his toilet, missing it in all probability. He would also be using his shower, and the thought of a naked, wrinkly old man in his tub made Scott want to vomit. His razor and combs would be lying on Scott's sink, his Old Spice aftershave and deodorant taking up space in his drawers. Scott feared that one morning he might even go to the bathroom and be horrified at the sight of false teeth floating in a jar. To make matters worse, this man wasn't just ancient, he was also losing his mind. Diane had informed Scott of Walter's condition, and it absolutely terrified him. Was the old man going to go wandering off down the street one day? Or would he freak out and become some crazed madman foaming at the mouth? He wondered if they would even be able to leave the kitchen knives out anymore. Scott could just imagine waking up one night with a shadow hovering over his bed, the moonlight glinting off a humongous butcher knife. That thought alone was enough to make him shiver, until another one took its place. What if the old man died in their house? It was a very likely possibility. The old fart was nearly 100 after all. And who the heck lived that long anyway? He had to be close to dying. Scott's worst fear was that he would come home from classes one day and find the old man lying stiff in his bed or floating in the tub, or face down on the linoleum in the kitchen. What if the old geezer croaked in his bedroom? He would get the room back, sure, but would he even want it anymore? He wouldn't be able to sleep for fear the old man's ghost was lurking about, watching him slumber and moaning like Jacob Marley. Scott lamented the whole situation, wondering what he had done to deserve such misery. Now, the dreaded day had finally arrived. The moving truck was actually in the driveway, so he resigned himself to hide in his room, his new, smaller room. Being cooped up really didn't bother him, was how he actually preferred to spend his time anyway. He could close the door, pull the shades, fire up his computer, and lose himself in whatever epic battle he happened to be partaking in that day. He could be wielding a sword and fighting orcs and dragons in a fantasy game, or firing lasers at mechanized warriors in some dystopian future, or chopping the heads off zombies in some post-apocalyptic world, or blasting away with heavy machine guns at enemy soldiers in some grand, historic battle. Scott was a gamer. His platform of choice was the personal computer, something he could modify and improve the performance of the moment any sleek new component came out. His machine was subsequently top of the line, a tower he built from scratch with color-changing LEDs, liquid-cooled multi-core processors, maxed-out gigabytes of DRAM, specialized gaming keypads and mouse, and an overclocked video graphics card that contained more power than most software engineering companies. He played console games on occasion, but he just didn't care for them as much, far too limiting. It could take years for upgrades, and usually only when newer models came out, which meant having to buy a whole new system. With the PC, however, he could modify it piecemeal for the best possible gaming experience available. He also despised that most consoles were usually limited to a single television for display. By contrast, his PC had 3 interlinked monitors for simultaneous display in a full field of vision. He had a 26-inch LED touchscreen monitor in the center and 2 more displays angled off to the sides for total immersion. It also gave him the upper hand at whatever online enemy came his way. And the graphics were insane. Every splatter of blood was in the highest resolution, and every glorious dismemberment or evisceration was his to savor. His games of choice were massive multiplayer online games, or MMOG for short. There, he could forego the predictable, pre-programmed artificial intelligence characters and challenge other real people like himself, people from literally all over the world. It was the only kind of social interaction he cared for, really. He could still be around other people, sort of, but at the same time still be safely tucked away behind a facade of anonymity. His preference was first-person shooters, anything that involved running and gunning. The bloodier the better. There he could pwn, a slang gaming term that meant he'd not just killed an opponent, but had humiliated them, any noob in his path. There, in his virtual world, he was in total control. His gaming also proved to be surprisingly profitable. Scott's characters were so powerful that he would often perform virtual deeds in exchange for real money. Need a rare weapon in a game? Just transfer a few bucks into his PayPal account and he would get it for you. Tired of getting your butt kicked while leveling up a new character? For the numbers off a gift card, Scott would happily show up and be your virtual bodyguard. Need a rival taken out? Mail over a prepaid debit card, and Scott was your virtual mercenary. It never ceased to amaze him how many people were willing to spend real currency in exchange for things that were completely fictitious. It wasn't enough money to buy him a new car or anything, but still provided him with cash to purchase a new computer part on occasion. Given his love for his computer, it had been the first thing to get assembled in his new room. Everything else was still piled on the floor, scattered on the bed, shoved into the corners, or thrown haphazardly into the closet. The window shades were drawn tight, making the room nice and dark, so there was no glare on the screens. The new room sucked, yes, but at least he could still play and pretend he wasn't in it. Walter sighed as he looked around at his new neighborhood. The houses were old, but seemingly well maintained. Each had mature trees of some variety, growing tall and green, and most had decorative shrubs or flower gardens planted. Somewhere a lawnmower buzzed, and the smell of freshly cut grass wafted through the air. Walter mused that the reason the flora grew so well here was because of all the manure the politicians spread around on a daily basis. He also noted a distinct lack of American flags, however, a notion that irked him considerably. Diane's house had a mount by the garage, but they hadn't flown one since Paul's death. Walter made a mental note to remedy that. It was the nation's capital, after all. There should be flags. This thought in turn reminded him that he would also have to visit some of the monuments while he was there, especially while he could still remember them. There were the usual landmarks, of course, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the White House. But the two places that topped Walter's bucket list were the World War II Monument and the Arlington National Cemetery. The first was because the number of honorees was shrinking, and the second because the number of honorees was growing, often being the same people, simply transitioning from the former to the latter. He hadn't seen Arlington since Paul's funeral, and many of his old war buddies had been buried there. He longed to wander the rows, find his old friends, and let them know he would soon be joining them. The front door to the house opened, and Walter turned toward the two large men coming out. One was black, the other white, and both were dressed in gray coveralls and white T-shirts, with the moving company logo silk-screened on the back. Their names, ironically, Rick and James, were stenciled on the front. Both had bulky arms covered with sleeves of tattoos, something Walter had never much cared for, and both had dark sweat stains at their necks and armpits. Rick, the black one, gave Walter a nod as he wiped his perspiring forehead with a sleeve. "Almost done, Walter. Just a few more trips and we'll be out of your hair." "I'm just thankful I still have hair for you to get in," Walter said, which made them laugh. Truthfully, he was grateful. His hair had since turned completely white, but at least it had the decency to stick around. Sadly, the rest of his body hadn't had the same courtesy when it came to getting old. His face was a road map of wrinkles and age spots. He had to wear bifocals, and on occasion even had to suffer the indignity of wearing a hearing aid. He could still walk without having to use a cane, thank God, but he certainly wasn't going to be entering any marathons anytime soon. He was easily winded, and there was pain in his joints most mornings. Perhaps the worst humiliation was his bladder. He had to get up several times during the night to pee, and there had been a few times during the day when he wasn't sure he would make it to the bathroom, though he'd be damned if he wore any of those cursed adult diapers. Still, he supposed he was in relatively good shape for someone almost a century old. Rick and James disappeared into the back of the orange van for another round, and Walter knew they were eager to get the job over with. There had been plenty for them to carry. Cleaning out his old home and sorting through the contents, Walter had been bewildered by all the junk that had accumulated over the years. Some things he hadn't seen in decades. Old family photos, Edward's baby clothes and toys, souvenirs, even a few things from his and Edna's wedding, which made him laugh and cry at the same time. He had spent 3 weeks rifling through closets and attic space, sorting through the contents and dividing things into 4 piles: keep, donate, trash, or not sure what the hell to do with. At one point, he found a large box buried in the depths of a storage closet, and it took him a few moments to recognize it as containing all his old war memorabilia. It was covered in dust and, like himself, had aged considerably. It was much heavier than he recalled, or perhaps he was just weaker. He was rather dismayed to find a mouse had chewed a hole in one of the corners, but otherwise the box was still sealed from almost 70 years prior. He couldn't bring himself to open it, and almost added it to the junk pile. Then, at the last minute, he decided to spare it. Maybe in D.C. he would have the nerve to rifle through it. He could donate the contents to a museum, or take them to Arlington to place on the graves of his fellow soldiers. That would only be fitting, considering some of the stuff had belonged to them in life. As their commanding officer, many of their personal effects had reverted to his possession, either left to him by the soldier or having been rejected by their families. Had he known that one of the items inside would only result in more people being buried, however, he certainly wouldn't have spared it from the garbage bin. Scott sat bathed in the bluish glow of the 3 monitors, the fingers of his left hand dancing on the computer keyboard while his right worked the mouse. On the screens, his avatar, an obscenely muscled warrior in tactical combat gear, zigged and zagged from building to building, dodging bullets and explosions as his tree-trunk legs carried him in heavy strides. The scene was made to look like a war-torn city somewhere in the Middle East, and his character was armed with a mammoth rocket launcher that sent flaming trails of death in every direction as he ran through the ravaged streets. On Scott's head were headphones with a microphone so he could speak to his teammates via voice-over internet protocol. The sound quality was somewhat akin to listening to someone speak through a soup can, but was still pretty impressive considering he was conversing in real time with 32 other people all around the globe. "Okay," Scott said, excited. "I'm at the front gate. Anybody got a fix on that sniper yet?" The sniper was someone named The Curge, and he was camped out somewhere in the vicinity of the enemy base. He had been steadily picking off anyone who made it close enough to the flag that Scott's team was supposed to capture. The Curge was up to 13 straight kills so far, and Scott planned on ending his little streak. But he couldn't do it alone. He had tried, and only wound up as 4 of the 13. It was really starting to piss him off. "Listen, guys," he said into his microphone. "If we don't work together, he's just going to keep picking us off one by one, and we're going to lose. We need to work together on this." The responses, both verbal and written chat, came rolling in almost immediately. A few were for strategizing, while others told him in no uncertain terms what he could go do with himself, sexually speaking. The problem with MMOGs was that most everyone playing had the mentality that it was every person for themselves. They wanted to be a lone wolf and hoard all the kills, loot, and power-ups for themselves. Hardly anyone wanted to actually work as a team, so rallying everyone when the situation called for it was quite a trick. Scott private messaged the assenters and instructed them to form a perimeter just out of the Curge's range, all nicely spread out and safe behind cover. Then, they waited for the lone wolves to come rolling through. Once they did, they followed at a distance and watched, waiting to see when they would die and thus giving them a way to determine the Curge's kill zone. They didn't have to wait long. "Hey, Black Cat!" yelled an excited voice over Scott's headset. "My guy's head just disappeared by the schoolhouse." It was Michael, the only player Scott actually knew in real life. They were best friends who attended the same college, both studying computer science. Like Scott, Michael was a smart but antisocial kid who preferred spending his time in the virtual world. The only exception was when he would occasionally venture out for a professional baseball game. His family was from Texas, but were die-hard Cardinals fans, so catching a game sometimes helped alleviate any homesickness. Otherwise, it was video games, and if Scott was playing, Michael was usually on as well. "Copy, Goldfish," Scott said. "Number 14 just got fragged at the schoolhouse." Black Cat and Goldfish were the screen names Scott and Michael had used ever since either was old enough to log into a computer or hold a controller. Scott had chosen Black Cat because he optimistically figured it was bad luck for anyone to cross his path. Michael had picked Goldfish because he almost always had a bowl of the tasty cheese snacks near at hand. The two boys had very different gaming styles, however, with Scott preferring to charge ahead while Michael was content to hang back and defend. But they worked well together in a yin and yang sort of way. "Number 15 just went down by the market," someone with a thick Hindi accent said over Scott's headset. "Do not come up the main street." Experience had taught Scott that the key to locating a sniper was by seeing where the bodies piled up. This helped determine the sniper's line of sight and often revealed his position. "Okay," said another high voice in the headphones, either a female or a very prepubescent male, it was hard to tell. 16 just got fragged by the stables." Scott clicked a button and brought up a full map of the playing field. Using the points of reference, he saw all the kills were centered around a single building. "I think we have him," Scott said, and began running his avatar through a back alley toward the location. He slowed as he approached a corner and panned his mouse to cautiously scan the area. Up ahead, he saw a 4-story stucco building with a tall minaret. The top balconies were clear, much too obvious of a place to camp, so Scott began to check each of the arched windows in the floors below. He stopped when he suddenly spotted the telltale tip of a rifle muzzle poking out of one. The Courage was no doubt scoping around for number 17. "I got him!" Scott yelled, a bit more excitedly than he had intended. He quickly brought up the targeting system of his rocket launcher and aimed the crosshairs at the window. He jabbed the fire button on his mouse, and on the screen a rocket flared skyward in a twisting trail of smoke and flame. It impacted just inside the window, the explosion sending flaming debris flying in all directions. Scott had to laugh when he saw among it was a limp body careening through the air like a thrown rag doll. He laughed and whooped as it tumbled down, bouncing off walls and awnings until it finally thudded to the ground. The Courage's reign of terror had just come to an end. "Sniper's been fragged!" he yelled into the microphone. "Go for the flag!" His teammates immediately took up the charge. They were all strangers, connected only by miles of fiber optic cable and steady pulses of ones and zeros. But they all had a common goal: win the game and get as many kills as they could while doing it. Scott's grin abruptly disappeared when his screen suddenly began to flash red and his character emitted grunts of pain before falling to his knees. "Behind you, Cat!" Michael yelled over the headphones. It was too late. The figure had snuck up behind him and used a dagger to off him, rather than simply blasting him with a machine gun. In gaming circles, it was considered quite an insult. A notification appeared on the screen in a red font made to look like dripping blood. "Black Cat has been pwned by Diablo Dog 666. Scott cursed loudly and smacked his keyboard in frustration. "Sorry, bruh," Michael laughed. "Didn't see him in time." Scott only sighed, disgusted with himself. He had made the cardinal mistake of standing still for too long, and Diablo Dog 666 had come up from behind. Tough break. "Whatever," he said. "Meet me back at the respawn." He was plenty irked, but the beauty of MMOG was that you could always jump right back in and hunt down your killer for a little payback. As Scott waited to rejoin the game, there was a light knocking at his bedroom door. It puzzled him for a moment, because the only person who ever did that was his mother, and she was at work. Then he realized what it meant and groaned loudly. "What's the matter?" Michael asked over his headset. "I'm pretty sure there's an old fart knocking at my door." "Oh, yeah," Michael laughed. "I forgot your grandfather's moving in. What's he want?" Great-grandfather, Scott corrected. Probably needs a defibrillator or something. A second knock came, this one slightly louder, followed by Walter's muffled voice from the other side of the door. Scott? You in there? Scott sighed. Of course he was in here. Where else would he be? It's open, Scott said, determined to make the encounter as brief as possible. Turn on the webcam, bruh, Michael said over the headphones. I gotta see this. Scott tapped a button on the keyboard, and Michael's picture popped up on one of the side monitors. He was a mousy young man with a mop of sandy brown hair. At 18 years old, he still had a boyish face, with no hint of needing to shave any time in the next few years. Like Scott, he wore a headset with a microphone and sat at a desk cluttered with computer parts. The only difference was that Michael's was a dorm room. Scott's door creaked open, and Walter tentatively stuck his head in. He looked around, having to let his eyes adjust to the dark, until he finally spotted Scott among the clutter. Hey, sport, Walter smiled as he stepped in. Sup, Walter, Scott said. What you need? I'm afraid, old chap, Michael said, using a thick British accent, that I seem to have misplaced my tube of preparation H. Inflamed backside, you see. Scott stifled a snort and barely managed to keep a straight face. Oh, nothing, really, Walter said. He shuffled uncomfortably, obviously trying to think of something to say that would break the ice. I was just wondering if you needed anything. Lunch or something. Maybe get out of this dark room? Already ate, Scott said, returning to the monitors. It was nearly time to respawn. Walter nodded, trying to think of something else to offer. Say, I noticed there's an empty flag mount outside. You guys wouldn't happen to have a flag around here, would you? Both Scott and Michael looked at each other on their cameras, at a complete loss for words. Was this guy for real? For a moment, Scott was worried the dementia had kicked in. I don't think so, Scott said. We're not really big flag wavers. Walter shrugged, then began to navigate the piles of clutter and slowly make his way over to the window. Well, how about we hop a bus or take a cab to the store and buy one? Seems a shame to be in the nation's capital and not fly a flag. The truth was that Walter was feeling a bit lonely. After Rick and James had bid him goodbye, he wandered the house and found little to do. He had spent nearly an hour alone in his room unpacking, until he figured the far better use of his time would be to spend it with his great-grandson. Nobody really knew how much time he had left, really, so why waste it? Scott only furrowed his brow, resenting the intrusion in the one place in the world he felt was still his own. Maybe in a bit. I'm kind of in the middle of something. Yeah, Michael mocked in his headphones. Getting your butt kicked? Maybe you should go. It's probably the only flag you'll capture today. He started laughing, and Scott quickly tapped the mute button so he wouldn't have to listen to his trash talking. Oh, come on, Walter prodded. It's a beautiful day out. The sun is shining, and you shouldn't be cooped up in a dark hole. It's not healthy. I like this dark hole, Scott said, agitated. The old man was quickly becoming a nuisance, and he turned his attention to the computer, hoping he would take the hint and go away. He didn't. Once Walter reached the window, he abruptly pulled the shades open and the room exploded with bright daylight. Scott winced as it stabbed his eyes, and he held up a hand to shade them. He gave Walter a look as if to ask, Seriously? Walter, I'm busy right now, Scott said. Again, Walter didn't take the hint. He even further intruded on Scott's space by stepping over to stand behind him and look over his shoulder. You like computers, huh? Scott bit his tongue to avoid saying something crass. No, Walter, They're only all over my room because they've become intelligent and are currently holding me hostage." Walter noticed Michael's image on one of the monitors and pointed. "Who's that?" At this, Michael leaned forward, getting closer to his webcam until the whole screen was filled with a giant shifting eyeball. Walter laughed, but Scott quickly tapped another button to make the image disappear. Walter had to marvel at the technology. "He can see us?" "Yes, he can see us, and can hear us too. We've come a long way since the telegraph, Walter. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're in the middle of a game." He adjusted his headset and spoke into the microphone. "All right, the cat is back and ready to attack." Scott returned to his game, resigned to ignore the old man until he finally went away. Walter watched as Scott's muscled mercenary appeared on the monitor, now armed with a mammoth multi-barreled machine gun. Scott worked the keyboard and mouse, and the figure began to lumber toward the front line. It was immediately met with enemy fire, and Walter's eyes widened as the carnage unfolded. Scott's avatar and others began engaging in deadly battle using guns, knives, grenades, rocket launchers, and a plethora of other weapons, both real and fantastical. Walter recoiled as blades glinted, bullets flew, and explosions roared. As limbs were severed, guts were spilled, and heads rolled, he quickly found himself getting nauseous. It wasn't so much the realistic graphics that affected him. It was because there had been a time when he witnessed all those things for real. "This is a game?" he managed, utterly shocked and repulsed. His mind was suddenly flooded with grisly images, sights he had buried long ago. "It is indeed," Scott replied, grinning. His eyes were wide, seemingly transfixed, almost hypnotized. "And right now, yours truly is leading the board." Walter had to close his eyes and quickly turn his pale face away. His knees felt weak, and he placed a hand on the desk to steady himself. "Can you turn that off, please?" Scott only ignored him, shuffling buttons and racking up kills. "Why?" "Please," Walter said, almost shouting. "Turn that off!" Scott looked up at Walter, suddenly fearful the old man was having a mental episode. On the screen, his avatar stopped moving and quickly met a grisly fate as someone rushed up with a double-bladed chainsaw and buried it deep into his neck. Blood, veins, and sinew filled the air like confetti as the chainsaw effectively removed his head. Scott pushed the escape key, and the screens abruptly dropped to the main menu. The room was awkwardly silent as Scott stared up at Walter, mouth agape. Walter only stood a moment, one hand covering his face, which had begun to bead with sweat. Walter took a deep, quivering breath before softly saying, "I'm sorry. I just..." He really didn't know what to say. He was embarrassed and ashamed that he had startled the boy. His head was reeling, and all he wanted to do was to go to his room and sit down so he could let it clear. He turned away, saying the only thing he could think of. "War isn't a game, Scott." Scott watched as Walter shuffled out the door, wondering what just happened and what kind of lunatic had moved into his home. Walter eased himself down onto the bed and closed his eyes. He felt horrid, both emotionally and physically. His brain throbbed, and he felt sick to his stomach. The horrible memories brought about by Scott's atrocious video game had taken a toll. He thought to himself that if God had any mercy, he would make those images the first to be lost as his mind decayed. And his poor grandson, what must he be thinking? Walter had only wanted to bond with the boy, but had instead only frightened him. He felt like such a fool. Maybe it had been a mistake to come here. He was being far too much of an imposition. He looked around at the moving boxes and wondered if it was too late to call Rick and James and just have them turn around. His eyes fell upon his worn box of war memorabilia sitting in the corner, and he stared at it a very long time. If Scott only knew what horrors the war had brought, he might understand.